Jack Miller did not understand how quickly everything could be taken away. One moment, he was a systems technician aboard a long-range cargo vessel drifting between star lanes, responsible for monitoring life support balance and energy routing. The next moment, he was standing in a judgment chamber surrounded by cold-faced officers who had already decided his fate before he spoke a single word. The accusation was simple. A major system failure had caused the loss of an entire cargo block, and someone had to be blamed. Evidence was unclear, logs were incomplete, and real responsibility had been buried under layers of automated processes. But Jack was the lowest-ranking human in the chain of command. That made him the easiest to discard. He tried to explain. He tried to show where the error likely began, pointing out inconsistencies in the data streams. No one listened for long. The decision had already been made in quiet rooms he was never invited into. So they called it exile. No trial that mattered. No appeal that would change anything. Just a sentence written in cold authority, removal from all allied systems and permanent relocation to a Class Theta planetary body known as White Hollow. Jack had heard of it only once before. Most had. It was not a prison in the usual sense. It was worse. It was a place used by the Alliance when they wanted someone gone without the trouble of execution. A frozen world with unstable weather systems, thin atmosphere pockets, and temperatures that could break exposed flesh in minutes. No native life had ever been confirmed. No long-term survival records existed. It was simply a place where things stopped continuing. They told him this directly, as if honesty made it fair. "You will survive as long as you are able," one officer said without emotion. "The planet will decide the rest." Jack did not respond. There was nothing to say that would change the outcome. The drop came quickly. He was strapped into a sealed descent pod with minimal supplies. No escort. No ceremony. Just the hum of failing warmth systems and a distant red light blinking above him as the cargo vessel disappeared into space. Through the small reinforced window, he saw White Hollow growing larger, a pale sphere covered in endless white and gray storms swirling like slow-moving scars. The atmosphere entry shook the pod violently. Alarms screamed in unfamiliar patterns. Jack gripped the harness until his hands hurt, feeling each impact as the pod burned through layers of frozen air. Outside, lightning-like fractures of cold energy flashed across the sky, not electricity but something worse, temperature instability ripping through the clouds. Then came impact. The pod struck the surface hard enough to bury itself halfway into the ice crust. Everything inside went dark for a moment. Jack lay still, listening to the fading sound of systems dying one by one. The warmth regulator failed first. Then the communications array. Then the locator beacon, which blinked once and went silent. He exhaled slowly. He was alive. That was the first truth of White Hollow. The second truth came when he opened the hatch. Cold rushed in like a physical force. It did not feel like air. It felt like pressure, like the planet itself was pushing against him, trying to force him back inside. Jack moved carefully, pulling himself out into a world that looked endless in every direction. The sky was a dull white haze. The ground was cracked ice layered over darker frozen stone. No visible horizon. Just repeating patterns of snow dunes stretching into emptiness. He did not stand for long. The cold bit through his suit fast, and he dropped to one knee near the wrecked pod, using it as partial shelter. His training took over. Panic would kill him faster than temperature ever could. First, he checked what remained. The pod was damaged but not destroyed. 2 heat cells still functioned at reduced output. Emergency metal plating had survived the impact. A small tool kit remained intact. It was not much, but it was enough to begin. Jack worked quickly. His fingers moved stiffly, already slowing from the cold. He detached panels from the pod's outer shell, breaking away pieces of reinforced alloy. Using a compact cutter, he shaped them into rough barriers. Every movement cost energy he did not have, but stopping was not an option. The wind rose suddenly, sweeping across the surface in a low, screaming wave. Snow lifted from the ground in sharp horizontal lines, cutting visibility to almost nothing. Jack forced himself lower, pressing against the pod frame as he anchored metal sheets into the ice using thermal spikes from the emergency kit. He built a wall, not for comfort, but for survival. Minutes stretched into something heavier. His breath became visible immediately, forming clouds that froze and fell as tiny crystals. His gloves stiffened at the fingertips. He could feel the cold trying to slow everything inside him, his thoughts, his movements, even his heartbeat. But Jack kept working. He remembered basic survival training. Heat rises. Wind kills. Shelter is priority. That was all that mattered. He sealed one side of the wreckage, then another, forming a crude enclosure against the storm. Inside, he placed one of the heat cells near his core position. The weak warmth it gave off was barely enough to notice, but it was enough to keep his fingers from completely locking. For the first time since landing, he allowed himself to pause. Outside, White Hollow continued as if nothing had changed. The storm moved across the surface without interest. The planet did not care that a human had arrived. It did not care that he was alive or that he was trying to remain so. It simply continued its slow, frozen rhythm. Jack leaned back against the metal wall of his shelter. His breath was uneven, but steady enough. He looked at the horizonless white beyond his fragile protection. They expected him to die quickly. That was clear now. This world was not meant for negotiation or endurance. It was meant for endings. But Jack Miller did not feel like an ending yet. He looked at the remaining supplies, then at the damaged pod, then at the endless frozen world outside. Something inside him settled. Not hope, not comfort, but decision. If the planet wanted him gone, it would have to work harder than this. Weeks passed on White Hollow, though Jack Miller stopped counting them in a normal way. Time did not behave like it did on ships or stations. There were no days, no real sunrise or sunset. Only shifts in wind, changes in ice pressure, and long stretches where the sky looked the same dull white. Jack began measuring survival instead of time. One heat cell lasting longer than expected. One storm passing without breach. One night where the cold did not reach his bones as deeply as before. That became his new calendar. His shelter was no longer just a broken pod surrounded by metal plates. It had grown into a layered structure buried partly under ice. Jack had learned quickly that the surface was the most dangerous place. The real world of White Hollow was not above the ground, it was under it. So he went down. At first, it was small experiments. He drilled shallow holes near his shelter and lowered simple heat sensors tied to wires from the pod systems. The readings confused him at first. Temperatures were not stable. Some pockets beneath the ice were warmer than the surface, not by much, but enough to matter. Strange thermal currents moved under the frozen crust like slow breathing. He followed them. Over time, Jack learned that White Hollow was not dead. It was just hidden. Beneath kilometers of ice, there were shifting layers where pressure and chemical reactions created temporary heat zones. He began marking them carefully, carving symbols into metal plates and storing data inside the pod's damaged systems. These pockets became everything. They were shelter spots during storms. They were safe routes when the surface wind became too violent. They were the difference between survival and freezing. Jack's body changed too. His movements became more precise, less wasted. He stopped fearing the cold and started respecting it like an enemy with patterns. Every storm had a rhythm. Every silence between storms had meaning. He learned to read the planet the way engineers read machines. But he was not alone in this work, even if it felt that way most of the time. Far above White Hollow's frozen surface, in an orbital monitoring station that barely justified its existence, Maya Reed watched him. At first, she was just another assigned observer. Her job was simple: record the final moments of an exiled human and confirm system completion. White Hollow was not supposed to require much attention. Most subjects died within a few planetary cycles. The station rarely even transmitted full reports. But Jack Miller did not follow that pattern. Maya first noticed it when his signal beacon, weak and unstable, began transmitting movement data instead of failure logs. Instead of panic spikes or system collapse indicators, there were structured readings. Mapping data. Heat analysis. Movement tracking. She replayed the logs several times, thinking it was an error. He should not be functioning this long, she muttered to herself, staring at the screen. The other operators barely looked up. Give it a few more days, one said. The planet always wins. But Maya did not feel certain about that anymore. She began watching him more closely than regulations allowed. Officially, she was only supposed to record survival duration. Unofficially, she started tracing what he was doing. And then she saw it. Jack was not just surviving. He was learning. The data showed repeated travel paths beneath the surface crust. Consistent returns to specific zones. Heat pockets mapped with increasing accuracy. It looked like someone building a mental map of a living system. Maya leaned closer to the console. He's adapting, she whispered. That word was not in the expected report structure. Days turned into longer cycles. Jack's signal remained stable. Not strong, but consistent. It should not have been possible. The environmental models predicted collapse long before this point. Maya began breaking protocol quietly. At first, it was small things. She adjusted his supply drop projections by altering timing reports, marking failed systems as delayed instead of lost. Then she pushed further. She accessed outdated archive files, old construction schematics, survival manuals, thermal engineering designs, and routed them through unsecured channels toward his beacon. It was not legal. She knew that. But she also knew something else now. He was not dying. One cycle, she sent him a basic heat redistribution diagram for industrial shelters. It was old, almost obsolete, and officially restricted to licensed colony engineers. She expected nothing. 3 cycles later, Jack adjusted his shelter structure. The next storm that hit his region showed reduced energy loss in his survival zone. Maya stared at the result data for a long time without speaking. He used it, she said quietly. From that point on, something unspoken formed between them. Not conversation in the normal sense. No voices directly exchanged. Only signals, adjustments, and patterns. Jack would send compressed environmental readings upward. Maya would respond with fragments of knowledge buried in old systems. He began refining his underground network faster. He connected multiple thermal pockets using carved ice tunnels reinforced with metal supports from the pod. He created emergency routes that allowed him to move beneath storms instead of fighting them. Each improvement made him harder to remove from the planet. White Hollow, once a sentence, was becoming infrastructure. Maya noticed the change in official reaction logs. Higher command began questioning why the subject had not expired. Requests for termination verification were issued. She delayed responses where she could, citing interference and data corruption. But pressure increased. One officer sent a direct query. Confirm environmental elimination of subject Miller. Maya paused before replying. Her fingers hovered over the console. She should have reported failure. That was procedure. That was safety. That was survival of her own position. Instead, she altered the feed slightly. Subject remains within unstable survival parameters. Observation ongoing. It was not a lie. But it was not the truth they wanted either. Below, Jack continued working. He had stopped thinking of himself as someone waiting to die. The planet was no longer just an enemy either. It was a system, complex, unpredictable, but readable. One night cycle, he stood at the edge of a deep tunnel he had carved beneath a thermal ridge. Warm air rose faintly from below, proof that his mapping was working. He looked at his notes, etched into metal plates and stored in damaged data cores. For the first time since landing, he understood something important. White Hollow was not empty. It was untapped. And somewhere far above, someone was helping him see it more clearly. Jack looked upward through layers of ice, though he knew he could not see her. "If someone is watching," he said quietly into his recorder, "then I'm not done yet." On the orbital station, Maya heard the transmission. She did not respond out loud. Jack Miller did not expect the ground beneath White Hollow to change his life again. For a long time, the ice world had been predictable in one way: it was always cold, always harsh, and always trying to slow him down. But Jack had learned to move through it like a system rather than an enemy. He no longer fought the planet blindly. He studied it, step by step, layer by layer. His tunnels had grown deeper over time. What began as small survival routes had turned into a connected underground network. He carved paths through compacted ice and frozen rock, reinforcing them with metal from the broken drop pod and later with parts he recovered from abandoned crashed debris scattered across the surface. Each new section gave him more safety during storms and more control over movement. He thought he had already seen most of what White Hollow could offer. He was wrong. It happened during a slow expansion phase. Jack was drilling through a dense ice layer beneath one of his warmer thermal pockets. The readings had shown unusual heat stability in that area for several cycles, so he decided to investigate deeper. His tools were worn now, but still functional enough for careful work. The drill hit something harder than ice. At first, he thought it was rock. But the material did not behave like stone. It resisted, then cracked in a controlled way, almost like it was responding to pressure instead of breaking randomly. Jack stopped immediately. He cleared the area slowly, brushing away frozen dust and shards. Then he saw it. A faint glow. It was not bright like a light source. It was soft, like something alive buried under layers of cold. Thin veins of luminous material ran through the dark ice beneath him. They pulsed faintly, not with energy he could understand yet, but with steady internal motion. Jack stared at it for a long time without speaking. He had seen minerals before. Ice formations. Frozen gases. Structural anomalies. But this was different. This was organized. Like veins in a body. He lowered a sample container carefully and chipped off a small fragment. The moment it detached, his basic scanner went unstable. Readings spiked and then stabilized into patterns he had never seen before. Energy density values rose far beyond standard mineral deposits. Conductivity was off the scale. Jack exhaled slowly. "This is not normal," he said to himself. He tested another sample. Then another. Each one confirmed the same thing. The material beneath White Hollow was not just rare. It was valuable beyond anything he had access to before. Not for survival tools or shelter systems, but for deep space energy grids. The kind used in interstellar navigation cores and high-output reactors. He had found something that entire civilizations would fight over. But there was a problem. It was buried too deep and too unstable to extract safely using normal methods. The ice around the veins shifted constantly. Pressure changes could collapse tunnels instantly. And the luminous material itself reacted unpredictably when exposed to sudden heat or force. One wrong movement could destroy both the sample and the tunnel system around it. Jack did not rush. He never rushed anymore. Instead, he observed. For several cycles, he studied the veins without mining them. He mapped their spread, their depth, their behavior under temperature changes. He noticed something important: the material grew in patterns aligned with thermal stress zones. It was not random. It followed the planet's internal heat flow. That meant extraction could be controlled if he understood the flow correctly. So he built something new. It started as a simple rig made from reinforced metal rods and repurposed heating coils. He designed it to apply slow, steady warmth instead of direct force. The first attempt failed. The ice cracked too fast, and part of the tunnel shifted dangerously. Jack barely escaped being trapped. He sat in silence for a long time afterward, listening to the settling ice above him. Then he rebuilt it. Stronger supports. Better heat distribution. Slower activation cycles. The second attempt worked slightly better. A small fragment separated cleanly. The system held. Jack allowed himself a short breath of relief. From there, he refined the process. Each cycle improved efficiency. Each extraction taught him something new about the material's response. Slowly, he began gathering usable samples. Not much at first. Small amounts stored carefully in insulated containers. But enough to confirm what he suspected. This planet was not just a prison. It was a resource field hidden under ice. Far above, Maya Reed was still watching. At first, she did not understand what Jack had found. The surface data only showed increased movement and deeper tunneling activity. But then his transmission packets changed. Energy readings appeared. Material classification codes. Unstable but structured mineral data. Maya froze when she saw the first full scan. "No," she whispered. She ran it again. Then cross-checked it against archived Alliance resource catalogs. Her expression changed slowly. This is not supposed to be here." The mineral matched properties of ultra-high-grade energy conductors used in deep space infrastructure. Materials like this were rare even in core systems. Entire trade agreements were built around smaller deposits. And Jack Miller was sitting on a planet full of it. Maya leaned back in her chair, feeling the weight of what she was seeing. If the Alliance knew, White Hollow would no longer be a punishment zone. It would become a controlled extraction site. Militarized. Corporate claimed. Jack would not survive that transition. She hesitated. Then she did something she had never done before. She opened restricted industrial archives. Not observation logs. Not public data. Internal engineering systems used by planetary mining corporations. Processing methods for unstable crystalline energy materials. Thermal stabilization techniques. Controlled extraction frameworks. Accessing them flagged her immediately. A warning flashed across her screen. Unauthorized data extraction detected. Maya did not stop. Her hands moved quickly now, pulling what she could, compressing it into encrypted packets. She stripped out identifiers, removed tracking tags, and rerouted everything through old maintenance channels that were no longer officially monitored. It was enough to get her removed from her position if discovered. But she sent it anyway. Down on White Hollow, Jack's systems began receiving new information. At first, he thought it was corrupted data. Then he realized it was structured. Industrial-level processing methods. Techniques for stabilizing volatile mineral fields. Controlled heat fracturing systems designed for deep extraction. He stared at the files for a long time. "This is not survival data," he said quietly. It was advancement data. He adjusted his mining rig again. This time, the results were smoother. Cleaner extraction. Less tunnel stress. Higher yield. Jack looked at the glowing sample in his hand, faint light pulsing through the frozen material. He understood something new now. He was no longer just surviving in White Hollow. He was learning how to use it. And somewhere above him, someone had decided he was worth helping build something bigger than survival. Jack placed the sample into storage and turned back toward the tunnel system. If this world had buried wealth beneath its ice, then it also had future potential. And he intended to find all of it. Jack Miller had spent too long speaking only to silence. White Hollow did not answer back. It only reacted, cold, pressure, and shifting ice. Even Maya's hidden help had become less frequent now, as systems above grew more strict and suspicious. Jack knew it was only a matter of time before someone noticed the flow of illegal data. So he stopped waiting for help and built something new. A communication relay. It was not large. It was not powerful. It was fragile, patched together from broken pod systems, mining rig transmitters, and old signal boosters he had stripped from wreckage. Every piece had a history of failure, but Jack did not need perfection. He needed reach. The hardest part was stability. White Hollow's atmosphere disrupted signals constantly. Storms of charged ice particles made long-range communication almost impossible. Jack solved this by placing relay nodes deep under the ice where thermal currents were more stable. He connected them in a chain, each one boosting the signal just enough to pass through the next layer of interference. It took him many cycles to get even a weak link. But one night, while sitting in the dim glow of his underground base, Jack saw a flicker on the console. A response signal. At first, he thought it was noise. Then the pattern repeated. Structured. Controlled. Not natural interference. Jack leaned forward slowly. Connection established, he said quietly. The voice that came through was not human. It was layered, translated, slightly delayed. This channel is unregistered. Identify origin. Jack hesitated only briefly. Designation, Jack Miller. Independent survival claimant. Location, White Hollow. A pause followed. Longer than he expected. Then the reply came. White Hollow is non-commercial. No registered activity permitted. Jack exhaled slowly. That changed when I started surviving here. Another pause. Then the system responded with something different. Not rejection. Not silence. State purpose of contact. This was the moment he had prepared for. Jack turned his screen toward the mineral samples he had been collecting. The faint glow reflected in the ice walls around him. He transmitted a short data packet, clean, simple, direct. No emotional language. Just raw value. Energy-rich mineral samples. Stability readings. Extraction potential. Then he added one more thing. A request, autonomous construction drones for extraction expansion. The reply did not come quickly. Jack waited in silence, listening to the faint hum of his underground systems. For the first time in a long time, he felt something close to uncertainty. Not fear. Not hope. Just pressure. Then the signal returned. Your data is significant. Another pause. Identify acceptable trade terms. Jack almost smiled, but not fully. He had learned not to trust early success. He responded carefully. Material samples in exchange for drone deployment. Limited autonomy. Controlled by my local relay. No external access. The system processed it. Minutes passed. Then hours. Finally, the response came. Agreement conditionally accepted. Transfer initiation pending verification. Jack leaned back slightly. It was done. Not fully. Not safely. But enough. When the drones arrived, they came in sealed drop capsules that punched through the ice storms like falling metal stars. Jack watched from below as impact signals rippled across his sensor grid. He moved quickly, navigating through tunnels he knew better than any surface map. The first capsule opened near a stable thermal pocket. Inside were compact autonomous construction drones, small, modular machines designed for excavation, structure building, and resource extraction. They were not simple tools. They were workers. Jack activated them carefully. She had one choice left. Continue inside the system or step outside it completely. Maya closed her official monitoring interface. For a moment, the station felt quieter. Then she opened a private channel, one that did not belong to any registry. It was an old backdoor communication path used for emergency colony coordination. Technically inactive. Practically forgotten. She rerouted Jack's data stream through it. If she was going to be removed anyway, she would at least choose how. Down below, Jack noticed the change immediately. New data arrived faster. Cleaner. Less filtered. More complete. He did not need to ask who had done it. He simply said into the relay, "You are still there." There was no direct reply. But the system output stabilized further. The drones expanded deeper into the ice layers, carving structured corridors around the luminous mineral veins. Jack supervised, adjusted, and refined. The underground network grew into something organized, almost like a city without surface. Then, one cycle, the trade guild responded again. Operational output exceeds expected thresholds. Reassessment required. Jack read the message carefully. He understood what it meant. They were no longer just watching a survivor. They were watching an operator. A builder. A producer. A resource controller. White Hollow had changed status without anyone officially announcing it. And Jack Miller, once an exile meant to disappear, was now in charge of something that could not be ignored anymore. Years passed on White Hollow, but Jack Miller no longer measured time the way he once did. There were no longer just storms and survival cycles. Now there were production reports, expansion logs, and resource flow charts. The frozen world that once tried to erase him had become something structured, controlled, and growing under his direction. It did not happen all at once. It began with organization. The tunnels he had carved alone became mapped industrial corridors. The drones, once simple construction units, evolved through upgrades and repurposing into full excavation fleets. Jack did not just extract minerals anymore. He managed systems, energy distribution, structural stability, automated logistics. White Hollow stopped being a place where he survived. It became a place where he worked. And then, slowly, it became something larger. Ownership. It started when Jack received a legal data packet from the Neutral Trade Guild. At first, it looked like another update about extraction rights and trade valuation. But hidden inside the structured documents was something unusual. A loophole. The alliance that had exiled him had never formally registered White Hollow as actively governed. It had been marked as abandoned operational space under emergency classification. That classification, left unresolved for too long, allowed independent claim registration under interstellar property law frameworks used for unmonitored frontier worlds. Jack studied it for a long time. Then he acted. The process was not simple. It required data verification, environmental proof of control, and continuous operational presence. But Jack already had all of that. His entire life on White Hollow had become evidence without him realizing it. He submitted the claim. Weeks later, confirmation arrived. White Hollow had been registered. Not as a prison world. Not as an abandoned death zone. But as privately controlled industrial territory under Jack Miller's authority. For the first time, the planet had a legal owner. Expansion followed immediately. Jack did not try to control everything alone. That would have been impossible. Instead, he built systems of delegation. Extraction zones were divided into sectors. Each sector was assigned operational codes. Drones maintained infrastructure, but human-level decisions were handled through remote interfaces and structured contracts. He introduced leasing models. Habitat domes were constructed for external workers and specialists who arrived under controlled agreements. These were not settlements in the traditional sense. They were functional environments, sealed, heated, and optimized for short-term industrial work. Mining sectors were leased to trade groups under strict extraction quotas. Research zones were opened for energy corporations interested in the luminous mineral fields. Everything had structure. Everything had terms. White Hollow was no longer empty. It was active, segmented, and profitable. Far above, communication networks began to shift. What was once a forgotten exile zone became a monitored economic frontier. Reports spread through trade systems. A world once marked as uninhabitable was now listed as a high-yield industrial property. And at the center of it all was Jack Miller. Maya Reed saw it first from within the network. Her role had changed long before this point. She was no longer just an observer hiding behind broken protocols. She had become part of the system itself. When Jack's legal claim succeeded, she helped him formalize expansion rights. When trade guilds demanded structured negotiation, she handled contracts. When corporations pushed for control, she ensured the system stayed balanced. She was no longer just assisting him. She was managing with him. In official records, she did not exist in this role. But in practice, she was essential. One cycle, as expansion reports crossed her screen, Maya leaned back and stared at the scale of it all. This should not be possible, she said quietly. But it was. White Hollow had become something no one expected. Not a ruin. Not a punishment. A functioning economic system. Then came the day the Alliance returned. It began with a fleet signature on long-range scans. At first, it was dismissed as routine inspection traffic. But the pattern was familiar. Military-grade observation vessels. Administrative command ships. The same structure that once controlled Jack's fate. They had come back. But they were not expecting what they found. As their ships entered orbit, their systems struggled to process the surface below. What had once been a blank, frozen world was now covered in structured zones. Extraction grids spread across ice fields. Energy lines visible through thermal imaging. Dome clusters glowing faintly against the white terrain. Data readings did not match planetary records. One officer spoke first. "This is White Hollow." Another replied slowly. It was marked uninhabitable. But now it was clearly inhabited. Operational. Controlled. They requested transmission access. Jack allowed it. The communication channel opened with delay, stabilizing through planetary relays. The Alliance representatives appeared as layered holographic figures inside the underground command hub Jack had built long ago and expanded into a full operations center. They looked around. The space was not primitive. It was structured, clean, and functional. Data streams moved across layered interfaces. Drone coordination maps shifted in real time. Resource outputs updated continuously. One of them finally spoke. This world was designated as disposal territory. Jack stood at the center console, calm and steady. "Yes," he said. A pause followed. "You were sent here as an exile." "Yes," Jack repeated. Another officer leaned forward. "Then explain this." They displayed the surface operations. The extraction networks. The leased zones. The industrial output metrics that now rivaled mid-tier colony worlds. Jack looked at the data without surprise. Then he said simply, "I used what you gave me." Silence followed. The Alliance had no immediate response. Their control assumptions no longer applied. There was nothing in their records that prepared them for a prisoner turning an abandoned world into a regulated industrial economy. After a long pause, one final question came through. Do you intend to remain independent from Alliance governance? Jack looked at the frozen world outside the command hub viewport. The storm still moved across the surface. The cold still existed. But it no longer defined anything here. He answered calmly. I am not independent, he said. I am established. The channel ended shortly after. There was no victory speech. No celebration. Only continuation. Maya stepped closer to the console. You realize they will come back with authority claims, she said. Jack nodded slightly. Let them. She watched him for a moment. You turned exile into infrastructure, she said. Jack finally looked at her. No, he replied quietly. I learned what Earthborn people always learn. Maya did not speak. He turned back to the operational displays, where White Hollow continued to expand under structured control, no longer a sentence, no longer a warning, just a functioning system under his name. The cold was never the problem, Jack said. It was thinking it could own me. Outside, White Hollow remained frozen. But now, it belonged to someone who had already learned how to survive it, build on it, and finally, own it.